Good morning. I'm Harley Schlanger from the LaRouche Organization with your daily update for September 23rd, 2021. I want to talk about the absolute crazy policy that the U.S. is taking toward Afghanistan right now. That if we're serious about ending these kinds of wars, why are we creating the circumstances for an even worse failed state in Afghanistan, which would bring about all the nightmare scenarios that people are talking about? A base for terrorism, increase in opium poppy production, starvation, hunger, civil war. This goes back to what happened on August 15th as the Taliban were marching into Kabul. On that date, Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen ordered a freeze on Afghanistan's financial assets held in the United States Federal Reserve Bank and in other banks as well. The Fed had $7 billion of deposits at the New York Fed. These were revenues of the government of Afghanistan. And another $1.5 billion was in other international accounts. The official statement released by Yellen on this was, quote, "Any central bank assets the Afghan government have in the United States will not be made available to the Taliban." Now, perhaps one could justify that as a temporary hold, as a cautionary note, to see what was going to happen. Were the Taliban going to be able to consolidate power? And what would that mean? But these assets don't belong to the U.S. Federal Reserve. They belong to the people of Afghanistan. The previous U.S.-backed government depended on shipments of money from these accounts to pay for vital necessities, including food, because Afghanistan is not food self-secure, medical supplies, obviously this is a necessity, fuel, and other government expenses, including just running the public safety, police, army, and so on. Now, Yellen, in withholding those funds, is acting like a colonial administrator. This is a classic example of how the British ran their colonies. It's modeled on the British Colonial Currency Board, which decides, as opposed to a sovereign nation making the decisions, the currency board decides how much money should be available and even where it should be spent. They assert their dominion over a nation. Now, how is this aiding the stability of Afghanistan? We say we want peace and stability. Well, then release the funds. If you really want to end such wars, that's the obvious point. Help the nation to develop. Now, the neighbors of Afghanistan are calling for the unfreezing of the money. The foreign minister of Pakistan said freezing assets is not helping the situation. As it's true, there's a total humanitarian crisis there. Food shortages, medical shortages, and so on. The president of Uzbekistan at the Shanghai Cooperation Organization meeting cited this humanitarian situation as a reason for lifting the freeze. President Putin spoke of this. And not just lifting the freeze, but then of going in and aiding the country in development, making credit available. In particular, at the SCO meeting, Shanghai Cooperation Organization meeting, there was a discussion of how to integrate Afghanistan into the regional economy, centered around the idea of the transportation corridors connected to the Belt and Road Initiative. Now, this is something the United States should support instead of starving the country by withholding their own income, their own money. Now, it's not just the U.S. that's worried about this. At this Shanghai Cooperation Organization meeting, there was concern expressed about what it means if you have Afghanistan poor, incapable of defending its territory. It becomes a safe haven for terrorists as it was in the past. The Shanghai Cooperation Organization, in fact, was originally set up as an organization to defend against terrorism, extremism, and separatism. As terrorists from the Afghan war, as well as the Iraq war and the Syrian war, infiltrated back into Russia, into Chechnya, and into China in Xinjiang province. So these countries have a legitimate concern about stability in Afghanistan, as does the United States and the whole world. If you do not allow them or help them to develop, it's likely they will become a terrorist haven. There's no funds to fight the terrorists, no funds to police the population. If this occurs, then opium production will rise again. In 1999 and 2000, the Taliban had reduced opium production by between 85 and 90%, according to the United Nations anti-drug operation headed by Pino Arlaki, who, by the way, we've called for to be brought in as an administrator for the Afghan Recovery Project. Now, if you don't have income coming into farmers by producing food that's necessary, they will produce opium. But it doesn't benefit the farmers of Afghanistan very much. It benefits the international drug traffickers, who are the ones who ship the drugs out and get the money, and then the banks that launder the money. And the final point is that there's a situation where David Beasley of the World Food Program has said as much as half of the population of Afghanistan faces food insecurity, with as many as 4 million people, including millions of children, facing starvation, disease. And then there's the refugee crisis that comes from this. Now, Afghanistan has been targeted by 40 years of war, not 20. We were there for the last 20 years, the United States and NATO. But the wars there started in 1979 with the invasion of the Soviet Union, which was triggered by U.S. arming and mobilizing a mujahideen force against the existing government of Afghanistan that was pro-Soviet. So from 1980 to 2021, there was fighting going on in Afghanistan, wars. That's why there's a problem there today. Now think about what happened after World War I. The Versailles Conference imposed punitive reparation payments on Germany. And as a result, the German economy was wrecked. You had the Weimar hyperinflation in 1923. You had street fighting through the late 20s between communists and Nazis, as you had a polarization, as Germany was not able to recover because of the payments. And this directly led to the rise of Hitler and World War II. There were some who said after World War II that Germany should be dismantled as a country. It should be made a pure backward agrarian society. But instead, Franklin Roosevelt and his allies launched a plan to aid the redevelopment of Germany and Japan. And these two countries have become American allies and industrial and manufacturing powers in the world as a result of that competent and sane approach after the war. Why would we go back to a World War I policy with Afghanistan? This has to change. And it's going to depend on the American people demanding that we stop acting like the British. Our American Revolution was anti-colonial. Our best presidents have fought for an end to British colonialism around the world, including people like Franklin Roosevelt and John Kennedy. We have a tradition of being in favor of developing sovereign nations as opposed to putting a foot on the neck of nations and having them pay their colonial masters. So you don't have to love the Taliban to be in favor of what we're proposing. Lift the sanctions, unfreeze the money, and then work with the neighbors, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, Russia, China, Pakistan. The United States is part of the so-called extended Troika, which is the US, Russia, China, and Pakistan. Work together on major development projects. This is what we owe not only to the people of Afghanistan, but to the Americans and other members of NATO countries who fought and died there, so that their efforts would not be in vain. So I think this is something that we have to mobilize for and make this a major priority in the Western countries, that we will not again carry out atrocious actions as a British colonial force. Thanks for joining me. Tomorrow is Friday. I'll be taking your questions. Send them to me at harleysch@gmail.com. See you then.